It all began with a flat tire. Matthew Caldwell, a wealthy retiree, was stranded on a scorching Kentucky road, unable to call for help. Just as frustration took hold, a young boy named Evan appeared out of nowhere, offering to fix the tire. But this simple act of kindness was only the start of a life-changing journey. What followed was a deep, surprising friendship between two people from vastly different worlds. Over time, Matthew discovered the strength of a family struggling to get by, the quiet dignity of a boy determined to make a difference, and his own ability to give back in ways he'd never imagined. How did one chance meeting lead to an incredible transformation for them both? Watch until the end to find out, and don't forget to subscribe and leave a comment below. We can't wait to hear your thoughts on this touching story. Matthew Caldwell, a wealthy retiree in his late 70s, found himself stranded on a rural Kentucky road. The mid-morning heat was already oppressive, and his silver Mercedes sat helpless with a flat tire. Normally, Matthew would have called roadside assistance without a second thought, but out here, his cell phone had no signal. Frustrated and unaccustomed to such inconvenience, he sat in his car, tapping his thumb impatiently against the steering wheel, watching the empty stretch of road. Just as the first hints of frustration turned into genuine worry, a figure appeared in the distance. A young boy, thin, perhaps no older than 14, approached on foot. His clothes were worn and dusty, and his sneakers looked as if they had seen better days. Yet there was something purposeful in the way he walked, his face determined and his eyes sharp as he neared the car. He stopped a few feet away and sized up the situation. "Got a flat, sir?" the boy asked with quiet confidence. Matthew nodded, caught off guard. "Yes, I do," he admitted. "I was trying to get some help, but my phone's not working out here." The boy, whose name was Evan, nodded and stepped closer. "No problem. My granddad taught me how to change a tire last summer. Do you have a spare?" Matthew gestured toward the trunk, where a spare tire and tools were tucked neatly away. Evan opened it, pulled out the jack and lug wrench, and set to work without a second thought. He moved with the steady assurance of someone who had done this before, his hands sure and practiced. Matthew watched, initially feeling a mix of relief and unease. Relief that help had come, and unease that it was this boy and not the professional assistance he was accustomed to. As Evan worked, Matthew found himself studying the boy more closely. There was a quiet dignity in the way he went about the task, a self-reliance that seemed rare in someone so young. When the job was finished, Evan stood up, brushed off his hands, and gave a small, satisfied smile. "All done," he said simply. Matthew reached into his wallet and pulled out a few bills, extending them toward Evangelist. "Here, take this. I appreciate your help." But Evan took a polite step back and shook his head. "No thanks, sir. I'm just happy to help." Matthew blinked, unsure how to respond. He was used to transactions, money exchanged for services rendered. This quiet refusal left him feeling something he hadn't felt in a long time: humility. He tucked the money back into his wallet and watched as Evan turned and walked back down the road. As Matthew continued his drive, the boy's words and actions stayed with him. That evening, he sat alone in his opulent home, surrounded by luxury but haunted by the simple kindness of a stranger. The experience left him reflecting on what truly mattered, something he hadn't questioned in years. For the first time, the idea of giving back, of making a difference without expecting anything in return, felt more valuable than all the wealth he had accumulated. That night, Matthew sat alone in the study of his spacious home, the ticking of a grandfather clock the only sound breaking the stillness. The encounter with Evan had stirred something inside him, something he hadn't felt in years. Despite his wealth and the comfort of his surroundings, Matthew felt strangely restless, as if something was missing. He couldn't shake the image of the boy's confident, kind smile and the way he walked away without a second thought, refusing payment as if helping others were simply second nature. The next morning, unable to let go of the thought, Matthew decided to learn more about Evan. He didn't have much information, just the stretch of road where they'd met and a vague sense of the boy's age. But he was determined to find him. Driving back to the same rural area, Matthew began asking around at gas stations and small diners. Most people hadn't seen a boy matching Evan's description, but eventually, a waitress at a roadside cafe mentioned a teenager who often helped people out without expecting anything in return. "That sounds like Evan," the waitress said, adjusting her apron. "He lives in a small town called Harlan. It's not far from here." With a destination in mind, Matthew set off for Harlan. The town, nestled in the foothills of the Appalachian Mountains, was modest and unassuming. Its quiet streets were lined with simple homes, many of them showing signs of wear. Matthew stopped at a local grocery store, then at a hardware shop, and finally found someone who recognized Evan. The man pointed him toward a house on the edge of town, a modest structure with peeling paint and a sagging porch. Matthew parked and approached the front door, hesitating for a moment before knocking. The door opened, and a woman in her 40s appeared. She had a tired yet friendly expression and was wiping her hands on a dish towel. When Matthew introduced himself and mentioned the flat tire, she smiled knowingly. "Sounds like Evan," she said, inviting Matthew inside. The home was modest, worn furniture, family photos on the walls, and the faint smell of bread baking in the kitchen. It was a stark contrast to the pristine luxury of Matthew's home, but there was a warmth here that he couldn't ignore. The woman explained that Evan often helped neighbors with odd jobs and that he'd been raised to lend a hand whenever possible. As they spoke, Matthew felt his earlier feelings of unease melting away, replaced by admiration for this small, tight-knit family. Evan eventually came inside, his expression lighting up with surprise when he saw Matthew. "Mr. Caldwell? What are you doing here?" he asked, his voice as calm and confident as it had been the day before. "I wanted to thank you," Matthew said, standing in their cozy kitchen. "I couldn't stop thinking about your kindness yesterday. You really made an impression on me." Evan smiled, a bit sheepishly. "It was no big deal," he replied. "I just saw someone who needed help." As they talked, Matthew began to see more than just the boy who had changed his tire. He saw someone who embodied values Matthew had long since forgotten: selflessness, integrity, and a genuine care for others. The encounter left him more certain than ever that he needed to give something back to the family who had given him so much more than a fixed tire. Matthew spent several hours visiting different places in Harlan, talking with neighbors and shopkeepers. He began piecing together a better understanding of Evan's world. It was a modest life. Evan and his mother, Rebecca, lived simply but with an air of quiet resilience. Their home might have been worn, but it was well kept, and the people in town spoke highly of them. Rebecca worked long hours at the local grocery store, while Evan split his time between school, helping his mother around the house, and pitching in wherever he was needed in the community. It wasn't long before Matthew arrived at their home. He parked in front of the house and took a moment to appreciate the quiet street. Modest homes lined the block, and the sound of children playing somewhere in the distance was carried by a gentle breeze. For all the stark differences between this neighborhood and his sprawling estate, Matthew felt strangely comfortable. He approached the house and knocked on the door. Rebecca answered, her expression brightening when she saw Matthew. "Mr. Caldwell," she said warmly, stepping aside to let him in. "It's good to see you again. Please, come in." The inside of the house was much as Matthew remembered: modest and tidy, with signs of a life built on hard work and family. Rebecca offered him a seat, and not long after, Evan appeared, his face lighting up with a mix of surprise and curiosity. "Mr. Caldwell!" Evan exclaimed, still wiping dirt from his hands. "What brings you back here?" Matthew smiled. "I couldn't stop thinking about what you did for me that day on the road. I needed to come back, to see you and your mom, and to thank you again." Evan shrugged in his usual unassuming way. It really wasn't a big deal, sir. But it was a big deal to Matthew. In the days since their first encounter, he'd realized just how rare and valuable such selfless kindness was. Sitting in their cozy living room, he found himself sharing stories from his own past, his childhood in a much simpler home, the lessons his parents taught him about hard work and integrity. He talked about how, over the years, he had lost touch with those values while chasing success. He admitted that meeting Evan had reminded him of what truly mattered. Rebecca listened quietly, occasionally nodding, while Evan seemed both intrigued and slightly uncomfortable by all the praise. "I just try to help when I can," Evan said finally. "I guess that's what my mom always taught me." "And you've done a remarkable job teaching him," Matthew said, turning to Rebecca. "You've raised a son with more heart and integrity than most people I've ever met." Rebecca smiled softly, her pride evident. "We've had our struggles," she said, "but we've always done our best to appreciate the small things." As the afternoon wore on, the conversation turned to Evan's future. Matthew learned that the young man had dreams of becoming an engineer. Evan's eyes lit up as he spoke about his love for building and how he often tinkered with old tools and scrap materials in the backyard. Matthew could see the determination in him, a determination that reminded him of his own younger self. Leaving their home that evening, Matthew felt more determined than ever to find a way to give back. He knew it wasn't about charity, it was about honoring the strength and kindness that Evan and his mother had shown him. They had given him a gift he hadn't even realized he needed, a reminder of life's true priorities. And now, Matthew wanted to make sure their own dreams were supported, just as they had unknowingly helped him rediscover his own. As Matthew drove back to his estate, the conversation with Rebecca and Evan lingered in his thoughts. The simplicity of their life and the strength they showed despite their challenges humbled him. Over the years, Matthew had built his world around wealth and prestige, yet he found himself moved by the resilience and warmth of this small family. He began to feel a growing need to do more than just thank them. He wanted to help them in a meaningful, lasting way. By the time he reached home, an idea had taken shape. It wasn't about charity or pity, but about paying forward the kindness Evan had shown him. Matthew spent the next few days making phone calls, reaching out to old connections, and laying the groundwork for something that felt long overdue. For once, he was using his resources not to grow his wealth, but to create a positive impact on others' lives. When Matthew returned to Harlan later that week, he wasn't alone. A small team of contractors followed in several trucks, carrying supplies and tools. Rebecca looked on in disbelief as the workers began unloading materials, while Evan stood beside her, wide-eyed but silent. "What's all this, Mr. Caldwell?" Rebecca asked, her voice tinged with uncertainty. Matthew smiled. "I couldn't just walk away after everything you and Evan have done. I've arranged for some repairs and upgrades to your home. Nothing extravagant, just some improvements to make things a bit easier for you. Mr. Caldwell, we appreciate the thought, but we don't need all this," Rebecca began, her voice firm but kind. "We've managed just fine on our own." "I know," Matthew said gently. "And that's exactly why I want to do this. Because you've managed, because you've thrived, and because you've reminded me of what truly matters. Let me give back in a way that honors the strength and kindness you've shown." Rebecca hesitated, then nodded slowly, her expression a mixture of gratitude and disbelief. Over the next few weeks, Matthew returned to the house regularly, not just to oversee the work but to be part of it. He wanted to ensure that every improvement, whether a sturdier porch, a repaired roof, or a safer swing set for Evan's younger cousins, reflected the care and resilience he had come to admire in this family. Evan, initially hesitant, couldn't resist getting involved. He began asking the contractors questions, learning about the tools and techniques they used. The foreman, a patient man named Joe, took him under his wing, teaching him how to measure, cut, and fit materials. Before long, Evan's natural curiosity blossomed into a passion for building. Matthew watched with pride as Evan absorbed each new skill, the boy's confidence growing with every project he completed. In those weeks, Matthew felt a shift within himself. For the first time in years, he felt truly connected to something beyond his own interests. He realized that helping this family wasn't just about repaying a debt or easing his conscience. It was about embracing the values he had lost touch with: kindness, community, and the simple satisfaction of making life better for others. When the work was done, the house stood as a testament to that connection. The once worn porch was now a sturdy and welcoming space, the sagging roof replaced with solid shingles, and the small yard filled with the sound of Evan's laughter as he tried out the newly repaired swing set. But for Matthew, the true transformation was the one he felt inside. In giving back, he had found something he hadn't even known he was searching for: a renewed sense of purpose, grounded not in wealth or status, but in meaningful human connection. Weeks turned into months, and the connection Matthew had forged with Evan and Rebecca continued to grow. What started as a chance meeting on the side of the road had blossomed into a friendship that defied their differences in age and circumstance. Matthew visited often, not just to check on the house but to spend time with the family. He joined them for meals, attended community events in Harlan, and even helped Rebecca with grocery runs. Evan's interest in construction, sparked during the renovations, didn't fade. If anything, it intensified. Joe, the contractor who had taken him under his wing, offered to let Evan shadow him on local jobs whenever he had free time. Evan quickly became a familiar sight at construction sites around town, notebook in hand, jotting down measurements, sketches, and questions. His enthusiasm was contagious. Other workers began offering tips and tricks, showing him how to operate equipment and troubleshoot common issues. Matthew, who had once been deeply immersed in the world of finance, found himself learning alongside Evan. He didn't handle the tools, but he asked questions about the projects and marveled at the craftsmanship. In turn, he shared some of his own knowledge: stories of running a business, lessons about planning and perseverance. It was an unexpected exchange of mentorship. Evan taught Matthew to appreciate the tangible work of building something with one's hands, while Matthew offered Evan guidance on setting goals and pursuing a career. Rebecca watched these interactions with a quiet smile. Though she had always been proud of Evan, seeing him find a clear path forward brought her a sense of peace. The worries that had weighed on her for years of making ends meet, of ensuring her son had a stable future, began to lighten. She didn't have to do it all alone anymore. With Matthew's presence, she felt supported in ways she hadn't before. Not because of his wealth, but because of the genuine care he showed for her family. One afternoon, as the sun set behind the Appalachian hills, Evan sat on the porch with Matthew. The tools from a recent project were neatly stacked by the steps, and the smell of freshly cut wood lingered in the air. Evan flipped through his notebook, showing Matthew sketches of a small shed he wanted to build in their backyard. It was nothing fancy, just a place to store tools and supplies, but it was his first independent project. Matthew listened attentively, offering encouragement. "You've got a natural talent," Matthew said. "And more than that, you've got the drive. That's going to take you far." Evan grinned, his eyes bright with determination. "I just want to build things that help people," he said simply. In that moment, Matthew felt a sense of clarity he hadn't experienced in decades. He realized that all the time and effort he'd spent with Evan and Rebecca wasn't just about them, it was about his own transformation, too. He had found a new kind of wealth, one measured not in dollars or possessions, but in the connections he'd made and the legacy he was helping to shape. As Evan's skills developed, so did his aspirations. He began setting his sights on higher goals, and Matthew, ever the mentor, encouraged him every step of the way. With Joe's guidance on the technical side and Matthew's advice on planning and preparation, Evan felt more prepared than ever to chase his dream of becoming an engineer. He enrolled in a vocational program at his high school, where he spent afternoons learning more advanced techniques, and Matthew made sure he had the supplies and books he needed to succeed. During one of Matthew's visits, Evan shared something he hadn't mentioned before, his desire to attend college. The thought of affording higher education had always felt out of reach for Evan and Rebecca, but Matthew reassured him that the path forward could be possible. Over several evenings, they sat together in Rebecca's cozy living room, poring over college applications, scholarship forms, and construction industry trade journals. Matthew reached out to his network, connecting Evan with mentors who had once been in his shoes. They offered guidance, answered questions, and encouraged him to aim high. Rebecca, ever practical, was hesitant at first. She worried about how they would make it all work and whether Evan could manage the added pressure. But as she watched her son light up with excitement, her concerns began to fade. She saw in Evan the same quiet determination she'd always known, but now it was focused and purposeful. With Matthew's support, the future no longer felt uncertain, it felt promising. Meanwhile, Matthew found himself reflecting on the past few months. The role he had taken in Evan's life, something that had begun as a way to repay a small kindness, had grown into a source of deep fulfillment. He saw echoes of his younger self in Evan's drive, and he felt a renewed sense of purpose. Matthew's visits to Harlan had become a regular part of his life, and the once solitary retiree now found himself part of a community. One day, as they walked through a local hardware store, Matthew turned to Evangelist. "You've come a long way, you know," he said, gesturing toward the rows of tools and building materials. "I wouldn't be surprised if one day you have a construction company of your own." Evan laughed but didn't dismiss the idea. "Maybe," he said. "But first, I want to finish my training and get that degree. Then we'll see what happens." Matthew nodded, a proud smile on his face. "You'll do great, Evan. I have no doubt about that." In supporting Evan, Matthew had also transformed himself. The man who once measured his worth in assets and influence now found joy in seeing someone else thrive. Evan's success felt like a personal victory, a reminder that life's greatest rewards come not from what you achieve alone, but from what you help others achieve. As Matthew returned home that evening, he carried with him a sense of peace and gratitude, knowing that he'd helped a young man take the first steps toward a bright future. By the time Evan graduated high school, he had become something of a local hero in Harlan. Not because he sought attention, he was as humble as ever, but because his dedication, hard work, and character had inspired the entire community. With Matthew's encouragement, he applied to several engineering programs. When the acceptance letters started rolling in, Rebecca was overwhelmed with pride. Seeing her son take the steps toward a brighter future felt like a reward for all the years of struggle and sacrifice. Matthew, too, beamed with joy, knowing that his support had helped unlock the potential he'd seen in Evan from the very beginning. On the day Evan left for college, the entire neighborhood seemed to show up to see him off. His friends, his mother's co-workers, and even Joe and his construction crew lined the small street outside their home, cheering and waving as Evan loaded his belongings into Matthew's car. Rebecca hugged her son tightly, tears in her eyes but a smile on her face. "You're going to do great things," she whispered. "And I'll be here every step of the way." The drive to the university was a quiet one. Evan stared out the window, both excited and nervous about what lay ahead. Matthew, sitting in the driver's seat, took the opportunity to share one last piece of advice. "Remember, Evan," he said. "It's not just about what you build, it's about how you approach every project, every challenge. Treat people with respect, keep your integrity, and never lose the kindness that brought you here." Evan nodded, his determination clear. "I won't forget, Mr. Caldwell." As they pulled up to the campus, Matthew helped Evan carry his bags to the dorm. The university was bustling with activity, and Evan was clearly eager to jump in. Before leaving, Matthew took one last moment to look at the young man who had changed his life in so many ways. "You're going to make us all proud, Evan," he said with a firm handshake. Thank you, Mr. Caldwell, for everything. With that, Evan turned and walked toward the dormitory, ready to begin his new chapter. Matthew stood there for a moment longer, reflecting on how far they had both come. A simple act of kindness on a lonely road had grown into a journey neither of them could have predicted. Evan had gained an opportunity, but Matthew had gained something even greater: a sense of purpose, a connection to something meaningful, and the knowledge that his life's wealth had finally found its truest value. As Matthew drove home, the Appalachian hills fading in his rearview mirror, he felt a deep sense of peace. He knew his friendship with Evan wasn't ending. They would stay in touch, and Matthew would always be there to offer advice or encouragement. But he also knew that Evan was ready to step forward on his own, to build the life he'd worked so hard for. And that, to Matthew, was the greatest success of all. The story of Matthew and Evan teaches us that life's most valuable riches often come from the simplest gestures of kindness. Matthew's chance encounter with Evan reminded him, and can remind all of us, that wealth is not measured by money or possessions, but by the connections we forge and the care we show to others. Even in our later years, we have the opportunity to give back, to mentor, and to inspire the next generation. In doing so, we find a renewed sense of purpose and fulfillment. This story also reminds us that it's never too late to make a meaningful change. For Matthew, helping Evan and his family opened a door to a more satisfying and rewarding chapter of his life. In the same way, each of us can take small steps toward generosity and compassion, whether by lending a hand to a neighbor, supporting someone's dreams, or simply listening with an open heart. By focusing on what truly matters, our relationships, our communities, and the legacy of kindness we leave behind, we can create a life rich with meaning, no matter our age. This heartfelt story of an unexpected friendship and lasting impact shows how one act of kindness can change lives. If it resonated with you, leave a comment sharing your thoughts or a time when someone's selflessness touched your life. Give this video a like if it inspired you, and subscribe so you never miss another story of hope and connection.